But so welcome back.
Yeah.
And it's coincidental that we're going to continue the discussion of Batman that we didn't get to finish on the weekend that the new Batman.
Yeah. And I haven't seen the new one yet, but looking forward to it. I hope it's as good as the first one at least.
If the first one is possibly subtly about faith, maybe the second one's about grace.
I haven't seen it, so I don't know. But I'm not going to do any.
And we're going to put the number up in a minute so that people can call in. We're going to try and get through all the rest of this Batman stuff. If you have seen the movie, do not call in and give spoilers.
Oh, for the new movie, don't.
I will hunt you down. I promise.
All right. So I'm not going to recap what we talked about last time. So if anybody wants to know what we talked about,
go watch the last one.
Yeah, Sodom and Gomorrah is the theme for Batman Begins, and we kind of move forward from there. We define the characters, and if you have questions about it, you need to go back and look that up before you ask. Okay, so I do have to recap one thing, which is that we received an email. So shout out to Felix, who pointed out the blue flower that we didn't have a discussion about when I should have. Felix pointed out that the blue flower, in his opinion, represented faith, and I coincidentally went home after receiving that email. The movie was on, and someone was at my house who is a theist, who loves this film, and that scene came on, and he said, "This is my favorite scene in the whole film." And I said, "Really? What do you like about it? What does the scene mean to you?" And I said, "What is this flower? Like, what is the point of the flower?" And he says, "The flower is just a symbol. What does he mean, if you can carry it?" And I'll go back and just read really quickly. What he's referring to is when Ducard sees Bruce in the jail cell, and he says, "If you're bored of brawling with thieves and want to achieve something, there's a rare blue flower that grows on the eastern slopes. Pick one of these flowers. If you can carry it to the top of the mountain, you may find what you're looking for in the first place." Well, the theist I was talking to also has done mountain climbing. And he said, "What does he mean, if you can carry it?" He's like, if you're hauling up a mountain, carrying a flower is not a big deal. He says, "How much effort does it take to carry a flower with you up a mountain? It's not like hauling 100 pounds up a mountain. Ducard is just making him do it to show he'll do it."
Yeah.
So it's a show of faith, and it's something Ducard wants him to do. And when I was involved with Christianity, they talked about that with regard, at my particular church, to baptism. And they would say, it's just a symbolic act of faith that you do so that you're just showing God that you accept this. And different congregations use different things. It might be you just accept Jesus into your heart, or you say your prayer of invitation to Jesus, or however, but it's this little thing that you do to show that you're accepting this, and then you go forward being a Christian.
Right.
So I agreed ultimately with Felix that yes, the blue flower is faith, and what's interesting about the blue flower is that the only time that it comes back into the film is later, when it's transformed into fear and injected into people as a mind poison. So I thought that was kind of an interesting segue.
Yeah, I did too. And after the last episode, and after reading Felix's email, I actually went back and watched the film because I had it on DVD as well. And granted, what we're talking about here, both with regard to the flower as faith and with regard to Sodom and Gomorrah as a paradigm for Batman Begins, is a matter of interpretation. It may be the case that the author never intended this, but what we're seeing, and what we're possibly seeing, is kind of, some might say it's a dearth of ideas, that we're constantly reusing these images and stories from our past because they tell us about who we are.
Correct.
So whether or not you're willing to accept that Batman is a Sodom story or whatever, that doesn't matter. But watching it with that in mind not only made the movie slightly more enjoyable on a later viewing, but it allowed me to kind of tune into different other things. When I watch movies or TV shows or whatever, I don't often try to look deeply for a message. The messages that I generally get from things, I prefer to find them in other people, interpersonal relationships, ideas and conversations. When I'm watching movies and stuff, it's normally just for entertainment, and I'm more than happy. Matter of fact, I'm pretty much forced to turn off my brain a lot of times because they're going to violate. It's just, we're going to throw out the rules of physics and do whatever. And even movies that are supposed to be science-based, I'm not even going to mention some of the abominations
Right.
that have done that. So,
Okay.
but it was more enjoyable the second time, thinking about what are these themes and what are they?
Right. I mean, the
possibly
general
saying?
theme is somebody who believes that it's fair to destroy the entire city because of those evil individuals who live in the city, that it is just a city that has gone to seed, and let's destroy it, and it's just to destroy the city because of the amount of wickedness in the city, which is the basic Sodom and Gomorrah theme. I mean, like you said...
It's also the basic Noah's Ark theme.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be, like you were talking about, the idea that themes will come up again and again just because there's only so many themes.
Yeah. Boy meets girl.
Right.
Blah, blah, blah.
And then we talked about Thomas Wayne. That's where we stopped last time. Thomas Wayne, his first input into the story was about telling Bruce, when you fall, you should pick yourself back up. And then his next message to his son is, don't be afraid. That's like the next, and those are the two things that Thomas Wayne keeps coming back with. Even after he's dead, you hear his voice come back, don't be afraid, Bruce, pick yourself back up. And these keep coming back, even through Alfred and through, but it's like it's his father. And his father is representative of that faith in humanity, that you can pick yourself back up, and that you should not live your life through fear, or be that influenced by fear. The next thing that struck me was when Alfred says to, what's his name, Bruce, when he's a child, Bruce feels guilty because he got scared. He reacted through fear at the opera, made his parents leave the opera. They walk out into an alleyway, they get shot. And he feels guilty about that, as though it's his fault, and Alfred says, it was him and him alone, do you understand? And this is foreshadowing Roz's involvement, because Alfred obviously has no idea who Ra's al Ghul is. He's talking about Joe Chill. But later we find that Joe was actually unwittingly acting for Roz, that Roz's goal with the League of Shadows was to make the city so desperate that it would instigate this type of crime. And that was his plan to bring the city down. And so Joe Chill was just he was as much a victim of Ra's al Ghul as Bruce's parents. The next thing I wanted to point out was what we find out later is Roz, he sets himself up as a concept of God by talking about like supernatural qualities, making yourself more than a man, making yourself a legend, making yourself a symbol. He gets into this idea of being more than human. And so Roz is obviously, in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, he is that archetype for God. But the issue with Roz is that he never actually attains the status of supernatural or more than human or superhuman. So what Roz really is something that's making a false claim of supernatural in order to carry out what he feels is like his right to execute judgment on the city. So Roz would actually be the symbol of a god as put forward by something like religion.
Right.
Okay, so there really is. I had read another review of this where somebody was talking about how God was absent in the Sodom and Gomorrah play that they're doing here. And at first I took issue with that because I was like, well, Roz is clearly in the role of God in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. However, really what it is it's that body of humans that puts forward the supernatural that isn't really there, that Roz represents. So in a way, God really is absent in the story, because they're saying, Roz is saying there is no such thing as supernatural, but you're as good as supernatural if you can convince people that you are. And that's all you have to do is convince the masses, and that's good enough. That gets the job done. And so here, we find out Roz is the concept of God, and he was responsible for the death of Thomas Wayne, Bruce's father. Roz begins to try to replace Thomas, who was reason and trust in humanity, in Bruce's life. So this struck me as a lot like the idea that religion takes away the sense of self-worth and self-trust and humanity in a person, and then gives them back that trust in the form of an idea of a God who can look after them. And because they're not inept at looking after themselves according to the doctrine, Roz robbed Bruce of his father, and he then tries to replace his father, and his dad has always been reason and humanity. He tells Bruce, we can teach you to become truly invisible. And then he also says, invisibility is a matter of patience and agility. And I made the note mental agility, because there's a certain amount of mental agility that is required in order to accept the invisible as real. And so I don't feel like that was intended in the script. It just struck that chord with me. The then they talk about, he shows them an explosive powder, and Ducard says, you know, you can use these explosive powders, and Bruce asks, as weapons, and Ducard says, or distractions. And to me, that's Ducard, the God icon, putting the emphasis on distraction. Keeping people occupied with distraction frees up the person or the organization doing distracting to act without notice. So if I can get you to look here, you're distracted, and then I can do whatever I need to do, and you are looking at something completely unrelated, but thinking that that is the issue. And I want to come back to this later if we have time, but I'm not going to get into it too deeply now. But it reminds me of the arguments on science that we've been having on the list, the idea that you argue over something that really has no bearing on the existence of God, and then you tie up all kinds of time and energy in this argument that really, in the end, will not impact your belief in God. Yeah. So, you know, it's that kind of idea when you talk about the sun revolving around the earth, you know, as being held up by the older church model, and currently we know the earth revolves around the sun, and the reality is when we learned that, it didn't cause a massive, you know, drop in faith, and people didn't just run from the church in droves because the model changed. Right. It didn't impact it, and yet the church fought that tooth and nail. Martin Luther was like scathing about science and saying that it was wrong to claim that the earth was revolving around the sun, and yet when it was shown to be, you couldn't argue with it anymore. It didn't, the church wasn't crushed. It didn't matter. It ended up being a red herring. It was just a distraction. It was something to complain about because people were interpreting a dogmatic view of something and saying this is what it says, and you can't say that it doesn't say that. And today, you wouldn't be able to find a Christian who says, yes, the sun revolves around the earth because the Bible says so.
Well, actually...
Oh, don't even tell me you can.
I
don't want to know.
And you can actually find people who still believe the earth is flat.
Don't tell me this. Okay, I stand corrected. Okay.
I mean, you know, we've done this before where we were like, oh, nobody believes in Zeus anymore. And then you get emails from people like, how dare you? You know, I still believe in Zeus.
Well, apologies to people who still believe it.
You're not going to find people.
All right. But I'm just saying the model changed in a huge regard. Now the prevailing Christian view is that, yes, it's okay to say the earth revolves around the sun, and it didn't impact, people didn't stop believing in God because the scientific model showed itself to be correct. Yeah. So those arguments about science are red herrings. They're distractions. They keep you distracted. Let's look at this. Let's argue about that. Let's get you looking over it here and here and here. And then you won't really ask, is there a God? Okay, so then he says, theatricality and deception are powerful agents. You must become more than just a man in the mind of your opponent. And so here we have, again, the idea of becoming more than just a man. But I wanted to note that he doesn't offer that it's becoming more than a man in reality. It's using deception and theatricality to create the image that you're more than a man in the mind of the person you want to affect. Right. That's all that matters. It's not about, you know, being supernatural. It's about convincing someone that you are. That's all that it's required. Then the next thing that I wanted to point out was Ducard again, who says, he's talking about anger. And he says that impossible anger, strangling the grief until the memory of your loved one is just a poison in your veins. And one day you catch yourself wishing the person you loved had never existed so you'd be spared your pain. And this is an appeal, again, to salvation from one's own pain. He's telling Bruce, I understand your pain, but I can save you from this. It's a twist on the standard
religious view on pain, which in this case, he's saying, you know, essentially you get to the point where you wish they never existed so you wouldn't feel the pain. And what religion, Christianity in particular, does in general is instead of saying they never existed to avoid the pain, you deny the fact that they're dead. Right. They are, in fact, living on somewhere else and enjoying a better life, and that eases your pain of having lost something.
And that's ultimately, he's presenting a model that says, Bruce, I can help you deal with your pain. I can help you. I can fix this, and I can save you from this, you know, because you need my help. And he says, your anger gives you great power, but if you let it, it will destroy you, as it almost did me. And Bruce says, what stopped it? And Ducard says, vengeance. And this is that is the Sodom and Gomorrah story. Vengeance rains down from heaven, destroys the city. And so this is what Ducard is promoting is, you know, vengeance, and he sees that as justice, and we're going to talk about the difference in a little bit.
Vengeance is mine, saith Ducard.
Rachel is like the voice of reason in the discussion on vengeance versus justice.
Which is particularly ironic, since her brain has been poisoned by Scientology in real life.
Yeah, well, love is blind, right? So meting out vengeance is put forward as a means to cope with pain. Bruce has a flashback showing his realization that revenge and justice are, quote, never the same thing. And that's a quote from Rachel. According to the film, if one acts out of vengeance, one cannot claim to be just. So in the film, the idea that a vengeful act can also be a just act is blanketly denied. According to the philosophy of this film, that those two things are not compatible ever. Let's see. Bruce says, should I just bury the past out there with my parents? He's talking to Alfred. And Alfred says, I wouldn't presume to tell you what you should do with your past. Just know that there are those of us who care about what you do with your future. This is relevant because this reinforces that we have choices and control over our destinies. Again, we've got Alfred who takes on the voice of reason. He's by far the best replacement for the reason that died with Bruce's father. Alfred is a very compassionate character, and he's very caring and concerned about Bruce's welfare and not about just using him as a tool. So he tells Bruce, I care what you do with your future. I'm not going to tell you how to deal with your past. I'm just saying I care about your future and I care what you do with it. And that's very different to Descartes telling him, here's what I want you to do with your future. So Descartes is driving that and giving him the direction, whereas Alfred is basically saying, as long as it's constructive, that's all I want for you, is to pick something that's happy, healthy, move forward in a way that is good. I care about it. So Descartes actually had stated, will is everything, the will to act. But Descartes has only one will and one action, which is vengeance achieved through fear. That's the only means he incorporates. When Rachel comes to talk to Bruce about the hearing for Joe Chill, he says, this man killed my parents. I can't let this pass. And this is a flashback. And Rachel says, well, here we see that Bruce is still subscribing to the idea that he doesn't have control of his own destiny and that his motives are not a choice. So Alfred is telling him, you've got this choice going forward. I care about what you do with your future. And he's telling Rachel, I can't let this go. But in reality, he's the only one that can let it go. It's up to him. I mean, he doesn't have to let it go, but he certainly has that choice, but he hasn't recognized yet that he's in control of that. So then in court, Joe Chill says, not a day goes by that I don't wish I could take back what I did. Sure, I was desperate like a lot of people back then, but that don't change what I did. Ironically, it's Chill who points out that no situation dictates action, and that any action, even action of a desperate man, is subject to choice. So even Joe Chill, after what he did and being literally, just on the bottom of the economic, pile, somebody who was, anyone could relate to the desperation he was under, and yet he's standing there saying, I had a choice, and I killed somebody, and it wasn't right. So then Rachel tells Bruce when they're discussing the hearing. Joe Chill, of course, is assassinated right after the hearing, and Rachel tells Bruce. He says, my parents deserve justice. And Rachel says, you're not talking about justice, you're talking about revenge. And he says, sometimes they're the same. And Rachel says, no, they're never the same. Justice is about harmony. Revenge is about making yourself feel better. Then when they're driving into the Narrows, they're having the argument, and she drives to where Falcone is at the nightclub in the Narrows. And she says, you care about justice, look beyond your own pain. And she points out how there's people preying on the desperate, and as long as he keeps, and she's talking about Falcone here, she doesn't know anything about Ra's al Ghul at this point, but Falcone and everyone else is thriving because of a system that Ra's al Ghul has put in motion in this city. So ultimately, every time they talk about a criminal or a criminal action in the city, it is a reaction to something Ra's al Ghul has started. It's like a trickle down. So she says, as long as he keeps the good people scared, what chance does Gotham have when the good people do nothing? And this is talking about, there's a paralyzing power of fear, and the type of person who gains benefits from it is somebody like Falcone. When a group of, or a person promotes fear as a reason you need to be on board, fear that you can't take care of yourself adequately, or fear of hell, stay calm and think carefully. That would be my advice. Don't freak out. Don't be afraid. Just stop and think. Should I react from fear, or should I just take a look at this and examine it and keep a cool head while I'm checking the data here and making sure that I actually have something to be afraid of? Bruce goes in to see Falcone, and he says, I'm not afraid of you. And Falcone says, that's because you think you've got nothing to lose, but you haven't thought about it. You haven't thought about your lady friend in the DA's office. You haven't thought about your old butler. And of course, he's making a threat. So then Falcone wraps up at the end of his speech and he says, "You always fear what you don't understand." And how many times, this is what I thought, how many times have we heard that no human can understand God from the same fearful people who present Pascal's wager? You know, it's like brought to you by the fearful. Here is Pascal's wager. And you can't understand this thing. We can't understand it. We just need to be afraid of consequences, but we can't really explain any of it. If the more you can understand it, the less you would fear it, but that's why religion can't explain it, because there is no understanding it. So the fear lives on. Descartes says, "When you lived among the criminals, did you start to pity them?" And Bruce says, "The first time I stole so that I wouldn't starve, yes, I lost many assumptions about the simple nature of right and wrong." And I wanted to point that out because Bruce, again, he's in this, I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in a minute, but he comes from a lineage of humanitarian people. It's not just him, but his father, and it's not just his father, but they mention his grandfather later in the film as well. And so the whole lineage of the Wayne family is a humanitarian lineage. It's like the family itself represents this humanitarian cause. And Bruce is saying that he sees shades of gray here. It wasn't just about right and wrong, that when he started to live like a criminal, he began to see that, you know, if you have to steal to feed yourself, that's a whole different game. It's easy to sit when you're not starving and judge somebody else that's starving and say, well, you stole. But when it was me starving, suddenly it didn't seem quite as wrong for me to steal that food. And then Descartes says, "You fear your own power, the drive to do great or terrible things." But isn't that what fear-based religions distract us from? Don't you dare try to rely on yourself. That's dangerous and wrong. Fear that and just follow. And many times I've heard the argument from some Christians and some apologists who say, you know, oh, if it weren't for religion, people would be horribly immoral. It would just be, you know, awful, sinful, murder, rape, you know, just craziness. And this is a way to get people to fear. Yes, there's a capacity. But the question is there a reason to fear that everyone is just going to go out and cause mayhem and harm?
We dealt with that same thing last week with the caller that called in at one point in the show to imply that people needed religion. And we talked about how that was, you know, possibly an overly condescending notion.
Right.
And you pointed out after the show's over, and I'll just go ahead and let you do it again. You know, when we talked about people don't need religion in order to be moral, and religion doesn't make people more moral, and a lack of religion doesn't make people immoral. And we don't have to look much further than, you know, crime statistics to understand that. But there was an example that you came up with.
It was actually a quote from Steven Pinker that I read in God Delusion, and Pinker described a police strike. And it was a real story. It wasn't just like a hypothetical. He was saying that when he was young, there was a police strike where he lived in Canada, and his parents were freaked out, saying that, you know, it's going to be horrible. There's going to be all this crime on the streets. And Steven Pinker was a little bit idealistic at the time and felt like, no, people will still be good. We're not in line just because of the police. And sure enough, the strike went forward, and there was looting, and there was mayhem, and it was chaos, and they had to call in the whatever their National Guard is. Yeah, they had to call them in and restore order to that city by martial law. And the point is, the police keep people in line if the people need to be kept in line. So all the people who were moral, who were good people, who didn't want to hurt anybody, stayed home in their locked house and said, I'm not going out there because I'm scared of the people that aren't that, you know, self-controlled or that caring or that humanitarian. And all the people that were prone to being what we would call immoral, like going out and stealing and robbing and harming somebody, those people did go out and do it, but they seemed to go out and do it despite the fact that God was still watching, but the cops weren't there. So it seems that it's not God that keeps the bad people in line. It seems to be the threat of actual police force, at least here, or in this
unless you want to make the claim that all the religious people stayed home and all of those evil atheists are the ones who went out looting.
Right, but the question is, if it's only God that keeps us in line, why aren't we out looting now? It's the police, right? Because otherwise I probably would be out, you know, looting and whatever.
Actually, some of us probably wouldn't be out looting even if the police weren't out. I would be one of those people, and this is not any kind of, oh, look how moral and pure I am. I'd be one of the people who was at home, probably watching the looting on TV, because I don't want to go out there. And that's nuts. I mean, I don't need an HD TV and a loaf of bread so much that I'm going to go out and risk the other lunatics who are out there,
Right.
pillaging and killing and whatever.
Right.
Yeah, so I'd stay home and watch it on TV.
Okay. Anyway, that was pretty much the point. So he's saying you fear yourself, and that's something that a lot of people that are religious have that idea that it's a fear of self. That if it weren't for the religion, I wouldn't be in line. And it's sad that you fear yourself and that you fear your
if you're one of those
capacities.
people who really think that you would be out constantly misbehaving if it weren't for religion, keep going to church, keep believing. I don't want you out there doing that stuff.
Right.
I don't want you to be an atheist. By the way, the number's up on your screen right now. We're going to continue going through this and try and finish it. Also, as a quick note, if you don't get through on the phones today or you don't want to, you can email tv@atheist-community.org. And while we're talking about the original, I was going to say the original Batman movie, the previous Batman movie, since there's been this huge string of them, and kind of interpretations of it. Batman Begins, actually, is the name of it. There's an individual who I know through the show, somebody who's written in, who did a similar treatment of Serenity. And, I don't know if this is up everybody's alley or not. As I said, I'm not usually watching movies and sci-fi shows or whatever to get some deeper meaning.
Right.
But I have found this kind of interesting. So if you have kind of a deeper meaning take on a particular movie or something you notice that you think is relevant, you can email that as well. Any email that comes in, we'll of course read. We can't always necessarily respond, but I kind of find these topics potentially, fascinating, because not so much about, some writer was particularly clever and delivered a message, because it tells us more about who we are.
Right.
And these are, like I said, these are the same stories repeating over and over.
Okay, so he says, let's see. Men fear most what they cannot see. You have to become a terrible thought, a wraith. You have to become an idea. So basically he's saying right here, people will fear what they can't see. You need to become a spirit. I mean, he says it outright. Feel terror cloud your senses. Feel its power to distort, to control, and know that this power can be yours. And we know his method is just simply, deceive the person into believing that you're more than you are, and that way you can control them. Remember, that's Roz. That Roz is not empowering Bruce here. He's grooming him to do Roz's bidding. He's given him this power in order to empower Bruce to follow his name, and again, the note that you can't think clearly when you're afraid, when you're worried about what you might lose, because that's the power to distort and the power to control that fear presents. Roz also has to say, the city has become a breeding ground for suffering and injustice. Here's where it starts to get really into the core Sodom and Gomorrah dialogue.
Right.
Roz says, the city has become a breeding ground for suffering and injustices. It is beyond saving. Like, there's just no point in saving it. And then Ducard, who is pretending not to be Ra's al Ghul at this point, says, Ra's al Ghul rescued us from the darkest corners of our own hearts, which that's what religion offers. Religions of salvation, that's what they offer. Bruce says people need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy. I can't do that as Bruce Wayne. As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, destroyed. But as a symbol, I can be incorruptible. I can be everlasting. And I just don't... Bruce decides to become a god himself, and I'm putting God in quotes. Bruce decides to become the symbol, the icon of a god himself, and destroy evil by making those who prey on fear afraid of him. In the end, he finds that all the corruption stems from Ra's, and the two symbols do battle, God versus humanity. Bruce also describes the symbol as something elemental, something terrifying. And then the next part that was significant in my mind was when Alfred says, your great-great-grandfather was involved in the Underground Railroad, he's talking to Bruce, secretly transporting freed slaves to the North. So Wayne's whole family represents humanity, with his father's contributions to free people from the Depression, his grandfather's contribution to free the slaves, and Bruce's contribution to free people from fear. They took risks, they didn't fear, and acted independently, trusting their own sense of right. And then, let's see. This is a quote from Falcone. Ignorance is bliss, my friend. Don't burden yourself with the secrets of scary people. Ignorance is bliss. And again, the distraction of fear helps to allow people to take advantage of others so long as no one looks too closely at what's happening. At what's happening. And while we fear, we don't. So he's saying, don't even ask. And this comes up again when Rachel's boss goes down to look at the crates. And there's 2 security guards who are corrupt who say, we don't want to know what's in that crate. So don't burden yourself with scary things. Ignorance is, keeps you happy.
You see this a lot, the I don't want to know or I'm scared. I mean, and different things terrify different people. I remember when Blair Witch Project came out, I, of course, was led on the fact that the pre-movie hype of this being a true story wasn't the case, as I think most people were. But my roommate and I went and saw it with his girlfriend at the time, who was not made aware of that. Oh. And legitimately went into this believing that she was seeing film footage that was recovered. Now, even if I hadn't known, about 30 or 40 minutes into it,
you'd have guessed.
I would have completely known, yeah. If not earlier. But there's nothing at all scary in the movie, apart from building tension. And you've seen people cover their face in the movies. I don't want to see the bad guy, even though I know it's coming. She actually got up and walked out with like 2 minutes left to go in the movie. They're in the house, the guy's going down the stairs, and she walks out of the theater just absolutely terrified. Wow. So this idea of not wanting to confront the things that we fear is kind of strong and universal.
Oh yeah, and absolutely.
Yet, for some reason, horror movies still do really well.
I can't. It takes a particular brand of horror film to scare me. Like 90% of horror films don't scare me, but there's like a few that I'm like, okay, that's creepy. Yeah, I shouldn't watch that by myself. But yeah, and it is. It's just we have fear. It's part of our biology. So yeah, and triggering that can be, as long as it's to some degree exciting and fun, and to some degree not very fun. It just depends on what's going on.
I don't mind horror films at all. I like them a little bit. I don't watch them all the time, but I don't know that I'm ever scared by them. I may be startled. I mean, they work really well to startle you. But I can remember earlier, and I won't necessarily blame this on religion. I don't think religion necessarily made me scared. I think religion played upon my fears, and I've since eliminated a lot of them. But one of the movies that took me forever to actually watch was The Shining.
Okay.
And it's because there's a scene, and those of you who've watched it know it very well will know it right off the bat. I don't know why this particular thing is scary, but the kid is laying in bed and all of a sudden just opens his mouth and just is, in this silent scream, there's nothing else going on. And every time they'd come on, boom, turn the TV off, let's go do something else, turn the lights back on, I don't want to watch anymore.
That's
and it was after, I think I made it all the way through, while I was still a believer. But it was this process of overcoming the things that I feared, including this notion of hell or this idea of a god or ghosts, devils, demons, witches, whatever.
Right.
And gradually overcoming those has killed off any fear that I get from horror films, but I can still appreciate them for what they are.
Well, right. It's just like X-Files. The X-Files movies I thought was exciting and scary. When all the aliens were, not the new ones, and I think that's not even out yet, but the original movie, when the aliens started coming out of those cases and they were waking up and Scully and Mulder were still in there, I was just like, get them out of there. I don't believe that really happened, but it was still scary to me, And Alien was scary to me. I thought that was like one of my all-time top 3
Alien's
scary films.
Fun.
It is fun, but it was scary. Jaws was scary. Jaws scared me.
I didn't get to watch Jaws when it first came out, but I know my cousin, who was, he's my age, he's born the same month, just a few weeks earlier, terrified. They went and saw Jaws, and they were supposed to go on a family trip to the beach.
Yeah.
No, I couldn't get him within a mile of the water.
Well, my thing was, I had a sibling that was 5 years older. And for some reason, I love my parents, but for some reason, the logic that, well, if he gets to watch it, I should get to watch it worked. And so I'm like 5 and 6 years old watching The Exorcist, watching Jaws, and it's like, okay, this is not okay. I should have not seen that stuff till I was like a teenager, but that was some of the scariest films I ever saw, was when I was way too little to be seeing
and
those
as somebody
kind of
who believed a lot of that stuff, The Exorcist creeped me out for years, because like you wonder how much of that could potentially be
You still
real.
can get your head around the idea of what it means, just like an Alien. You know what I mean? I don't have to believe in aliens to still think it's a creepy movie, or I don't want that thing to eat me.
Yes, but now I can actually watch The Exorcist and laugh.
I can if there's other people in the room.
Yeah, if I'm not alone, if I got
If
good
it's not
popcorn,
late
I can
and
laugh.
yeah. Okay, so